Okay, so we'll get started. It looks like I would think most people have joined by now. So there are probably a few remaining ones, but let's get started. Welcome everyone. My name is Jing Liu, and I'm the Managing Director of the Michigan Institute for Data Science, or MIDAS. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to mention a few housekeeping items. We don't have seminar next Monday because of spring break. Then we have 3 coming up. You can see on the slide here, March 7th, Jennifer Bob on EHR data. March 14th, Donglin Zheng also on EHR data. And March 8th, Clement Royer on optimization. So also like to thank our industry sponsors for the seminar series: Rocket Companies, American Mathematical Society, China Scope, Microsoft, Yazaki, and General Dynamics. So today, we're really happy to have Dr. Virginia Dignum as our speaker. So Dr. Dignum is Professor of Computer Science at Umeå University at Sweden, and leads the social and ethical AI research group there. Her research focuses on the interconnections of people, organizations, and technology, from developing formal theories to engineering designs. She's also involved in several international initiatives on policy and strategy guidelines for AI research and applications. She's a member of the European Commission High-Level Expert Group on AI, and helps create guidelines and policy on the European Union AI strategy. She's also a member of the IEEE Initiative on Ethics of Autonomous Systems, Delft Design for Values Institute, the European Global Forum on AI, the Responsible Robotics Foundation, and other similar initiatives. So she also writes extensively about AI and its social impact, both on social media, and also has a book, the title of which is Responsible Artificial Intelligence. So with that, I welcome you, Virginia, to our seminar today, and I'll let you take over from here. Audience members, please put down your questions in Q&A anytime. Virginia will either answer throughout the seminar or wait till the end.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words and for the introduction. Thank you everybody to be here. I'm looking forward to spend my evening, your afternoon with you on this presentation. Let me do the trick of hoping that slides get shared. Yes. Yep. Are you seeing my slides or the back?
I'm seeing a blank screen.
You're seeing a blank screen. Okay. Right. And now do you see? Let me see again. Sorry. Let me do this. Is it working now?
Yes, it's working.
Okay, good. Okay. I have some problem today with extending my screen over 2 screens, but anyway, so let's start now. So indeed, I'm going to talk to you, and I welcome all your questions at any time, and I will try to answer them as they come, but otherwise at the end. And I would like to talk with you today about what is responsible artificial intelligence. Why should we care about responsibility and other ethical principles in artificial intelligence? And more importantly, maybe, how can we ensure that AI is indeed developed and used in a responsible way? Every time I start talking about responsible AI, I always like to start with a bit wider question. And that is one that might be that for you sounds a bit obvious, but it's the question of what exactly is AI, and mostly not the textbook definition of AI, but what is the buzz about? Why are we at this moment all over the world caring about responsibility in AI? All these organizations around the world, from UNESCO to the United Nations to the European Union, you name it, are all concerned about bringing forward guidelines, principles, and discussing the issue of responsibility in AI, the issue of ethics in AI. So what is it? What are we talking about when we talk about AI? It's definitely something different than what I was talking about and many other researchers 20, 30 years ago when I first started in the field of AI. Of course, AI systems, it's about the computational the development of computer algorithms, computer systems that in one way or another are able of showing autonomy, adaptability, and interactivity with the users. I'm not going into the definition of this characteristics of this type of systems and these properties of the systems. But what is at the core of the issues around responsibility in AI is what, for instance, Kate Crawford has been very eloquently describing as the fact that AI, as we are using it today, as it is impacting lives of everybody around the globe at this moment, is not really an artificial and definitely not a very intelligent type of system, at least not intelligent in the way that we consider people to be intelligent, and not artificial because it couldn't exist without the work and the commitment and the participation of people in many different ways, from those that collect data, those that of course develop and write the algorithms, the ones who use and analyze the results. So there is a lot of need for human work in the AI systems that we are using. And like I say, these systems are maybe very good at identifying patterns and making predictions about those patterns that they identify in data, but not definitely not very good at this moment, at least with the most common techniques that are being used, are not very good at understanding the meaning of what those patterns really are and what are those patterns saying about us. So when we use this type of systems, it is for a large part dependent on our own interpretation, our own decision of how to integrate the decisions, the reasoning, the predictions that such systems make into everyday life. It is important to realize that AI systems, the computational systems that we commonly call AI, don't exist in a vacuum, are not alone. They are actually part of what I would say a social technical ecosystem consisting not only of the computational components, but also of all the people, organizations, governments, policymakers, and so on, that make possible that AI is not only developed and used, but also governed, managed, and being impactful in one way or another in our society. So when we talk about responsibility in AI, we need to address not the computational systems per se, but this social technical ecosystem in which the computational systems are just one of the many parts. And indeed, the success stories at this moment in AI are many, and I don't really want to spend the time it's not the focus of the talk, but we all are aware of all the ways in which AI techniques, AI methods and models are being successful using in problem solving, in pattern matching, in diagnostic, in robotics, and so on. Like I say, these systems are extremely good at making predictions within the set or the scope, the realm of the data that they are trained or developed or able to address, but they are extremely easy to somehow and in many different ways trick into make, because exactly they don't understand the meaning of what they are looking at. They are not able to really reason about deeper than the superficiality of pictures in this case. It is very easy to trick the systems into doing all kinds of strange things once the data that you are applying them to is not really the data in which they have been trained or tested or verified. These ones are maybe just simple case. But of course, it becomes more complex when a system a visual computational vision system trying to identify stop signs for whatever reason, because someone put some stickers on that thing, starts imagining or believing that the stop sign is actually a speed limit. Here is where we need to start thinking about responsibility and accountability. Is not the computational vision system that has any responsibility for this case. It's not the system that can be accountable for whatever happens by the errors that might happen in society because of this misunderstanding of what it's looking at. But we really need to start understanding how and when and what does it mean to use these systems in a responsible way, in a way for which we can be, we societies, we developers, we policymakers, we users can be accountable for. And of course, another issue is that even though all this huge amount of successes that we have seen in the last few years, it's still, we are really only looking at basically the space of what are the possible combinations of the world's data. And data is not reality. Data is always a subset, a very more or less consciously decision to select what kind of data is being collected over a myriad of options and of things that can be perceived in real life. So we really, with data and all the data-driven AI successes of the last few years, still are only scratching in the surface of what is possible in the real world. And we need to understand that we have to take the successes and the potential of this type of systems within the context, this tiny little context of the whole real world, and not really starting assuming and expecting that the system can cover the whole scope of possibilities. And that's where many of the concerns which all of us have been associating with the issues of AI ethics, AI responsibility, and so on come from. Like I say, the reality, the real world is much more than the data. And by taking data and what can be derived from data, we might get into the problem or the issue that we are taking this rationality, this capability of this datification, like many are talking about, as a metric for success. We are successful in those things that we can measure. We are not other things that cannot be measured or cannot be transferred easily into pattern matching activities or operations are then therefore maybe less important, less successful. The issues of bias, so data, and bias is not just about the biased data, but it includes all these type of decisions about who, why, how, when has been the data collected, what was the expectations and the reason to collecting this data. Is the data, how representative is the data of this, the environment, the world which it is supposed to be representative. All these issues have been extensively described in positive and also all the negative and the challenges and the problems deriving from biased data and biased activities, biased development, and so on, have been extensively discussed by many, many people. The issues of explanation, we do need to really be able not only to make predictions and reach conclusions with the systems and the algorithms that are being developed, but at the same time, if we really are to be accountable, responsible for those decisions and take the accountability for what's happening, a very important issue is the issue of explanation. Explanation is for those that require to be explained to, and therefore we need to see explanation as user-centered and contextual. We also need to look at explanation in terms of just in time, in terms of conciseness, of clarity and understandability by those that require the explanations, which means that the very same decision can be explained and should be explained in many different ways, depending who are we explaining it to and why are we explaining it. Issues about diversity, not only in terms of the diversity of the data and the biased data that we just talked about, but also issues of diversity in terms of who is developing AI, what kind of lens, what kind of disciplinary background are we taking on as AI is being developed? What are the motivations of those using AI, those managing and governing AI have? And there we see that there is still a lot to be gained, not only in terms of demographic diversity, which is extremely important, but also, and for a large part, also about the disciplinarity, the need for diverse disciplinarity in addressing AI. AI is, as if you look at the impact of AI in the current world, it's not something which can be understood, explained, or studied from an engineering of technology perspective alone. We really need to look at AI and development, the use, the impact, the challenges, the motivations, and so on, from a multidisciplinary perspective, including humanities, social science, and of course the engineers and computer scientists. Another issue which is coming increasingly more into the forefront is the issue of sustainability of what some are calling the cost of AI. How much is it costing the world to train, to develop, to maintain the huge amounts of data, the huge amounts of computational power that it needs to derive the conclusions and identifying the patterns that we are using for the decision making, for the predictions, for the understanding that comes out of AI. Is that justifiable, and is that the best way to achieve this type of decisions? At the same time, there has been a lot of work also trying to use AI to support issues around climate change. So there is a balance there. How much is AI costing, and how much can AI support sustainability and addressing the issues of climate change? So responsible AI is about understanding, yes, AI systems can potentially do a lot. The question is, and this is what many researchers, many practitioners are calling the question zero, is about, should we be using AI in this case? And who is going to answer this question? Is that the developers, the policymakers, the users, the providers, the owners, the managers? Who is going to decide about when and why and how is AI used in a certain, addressing a certain problem, a certain question? As we're taking these decisions, what values should be considered? Are we really looking only at efficiency and the accuracy of predictions, or do we need to take into account issues of safety, fairness, the cost, the sustainability, or the economic costs, the economic benefits? How are we going to consider those many different values? Who is going to decide, and how are we going to prioritize? Because in most cases, we know that we cannot optimize for all these values at the same time. These are the questions that need to be taken even before any algorithm, any data is being collected, any algorithm is being developed. And it's a question that it's much, like I said already, much broader in scope than what can be done with AI. And it's a question that requires answers from a much broader participatory approach than just leaving it to those that know how to build the AI systems, the engineers, the computer scientists, the data analysts. Responsible AI is about understanding that we want AI systems to operate within the law. Obviously, no one wants to have illegal systems which are illegal in one way or another. It's about understanding that we want systems to be ethical, to operate within the scope of well-accepted ethical principles, human rights principles, and societal values in general. But it's also about developing systems that are reliable, that do what they are supposed to do, and that can be trusted to operate in a robust and continuous way as long as we need them to operate. It's about understanding how and when and to whom AI can be beneficial. But it's also about understanding that we do need to be able to verify that indeed the systems that are being built are indeed lawful, ethical, reliable, and so on. And by verifiable, I really mean also the formal verifiability and verification of such systems. It is also what, so when we talk about this, all these issues, again, I want to stress that it's not only addressing the computational aspect of these systems, but really understanding that we need to include the aspects of accountability, responsibility, and transparency, ART for short, into this social technical ecosystem, such that as we develop combinational systems that somehow exhibit can operate more or less autonomously, we do need to ensure that this social technical ecosystem in which the AI computational components exist is able to take responsibility for the autonomous behavior of this system. The same way, as we develop systems that learn, adapt, change, and evolve, we do need to provide the possibility, the transparency needs to understand how is this adaptability occurring, what type of process, what type of choices, what type of decisions have been made. So in this sense, I mean transparency in a much broader way than what often is meant as the opening up of the so-called algorithmic black box. And again, if systems are interacting with people, are interacting with the environment, are interacting with society, a need for accountability exists that both provides the very needed explanations and accounts of why and how the system has reached a certain decision, and at the same time ensures that there are organizations, people, or other institutions that will be accountable in case that the system is not operating as expected and in cases in which some harm may occur. I don't know if there are any questions so far, but we can continue. I don't know, I cannot really see the chat usually, but if there are any questions, please at any time, just let me know. So going into how can we operate this type of issues? How can we make AI systems being responsible? How can we ensure that this social technical ecosystem, which is the AI environment in which we are increasingly more part of, how can we operate, make these things viable and possible? It starts by understanding and discussing and having this open participatory approach to understand what are the types of decisions that AI systems should be making. Is this decisions about our aims, our objectives, our goals, or should that be decisions more about the plans that are possible for the goals that we set ourselves? Is it about deciding systems that benefit me as the direct user of the system, or is it about designing systems that benefit the group, the society in general? And we do know usually that these things can be quite different in many different ways and in many different situations. It is also about understanding that as AI systems are increasingly making decisions and taking action directly in many societal situations, that what we hope that would be obviously aligned, what is legally allowed, what is socially accepted, and what is morally acceptable or ethically acceptable, are definitely not always as aligned as what we would expect. And we do need to understand that in many cases, these three aspects really go in three different directions. And the space in which we would like the AI system to operate, that in which all these three are aligned, is not necessarily a space that it's commonly and universally accepted as the obvious, or you just have to think about how American, in many states, you take, for instance, capital punishment, or how Europe looks at capital punishment, how we in the past have looked at issues of slavery, issues of human women rights and women vote. All these issues have changed, have moved from different within this scope. And as we have AI systems operating in the world, we really need to understand that it is ethics and acceptability are some things which are much more complex than what would appear at the first sight, maybe. Also understanding that we cannot really optimize for all those values that we want to uphold, and that in many cases choices need to be made. How are these choices made? Who is taking the responsibility and who is taking the decisions about this choice is also a large part of the discussion and the development and the process of responsible AI. Because ethical reasoning and the hoping that AI systems are able to reason about ethics and take decisions in all these trolley problems and more or less dystopic situations that we have heard in many different cases is not really in my opinion, not necessarily the issue. The issue of all this ethics and AI ethics, AI moral reasoning by AI systems is mostly to understand that it is not about the answer. Any different ethical theory can, one way or another, guarantee or justify many different types of answers to the same question. So the issue is not so much that we need to understand what is the answer, but it's about the issue that these questions need to be asked, need to be taken, and the discussion about what is the question, what is the issue. It requires a broader discussion in society. So it's not about answers, it's about recognizing that ethics is an issue in which AI systems are increasingly more operating in. It is also much more than this type of trolley problems that often have been designed as thought experiments, as a way to help us understanding the issues of ethics. But in real life, the issues in which people developing AI systems are struggling with is issues of fairness, for instance, and we, in a child support subsidy, fairness probably means that we should be providing the most subsidy, the most support to those who need the most. But for instance, again, in the child scenario, if we are talking about providing parental leave in a state, in a country, or so on, fairness means that independently of how much you earn, who you are, or so on, everybody should have equal rights to parental leave. And these discussions and how systems are used and developed to determine who should get what are often the cases in which big problems come if we don't really understand that there are many definitions, many interpretations of fairness, and what is implemented and developed in one case might be completely wrong or completely different in another case. Issues of safety and what do we mean for something to be safe, again, it depends a lot on the situation, on the cases, on the issues that are being developed. In traffic, for instance, you can look at safety as ensuring that speed limits are ensured and speed cameras and so on are in place and are able to detect speed violations of speed limits. But another way is also to look at issues of I don't know, seat belts and things like that, the construction of the cars. So you can implement safety in many different ways. Things get even more complex when we want to ensure that the system is both dealing with safety and fairness at the same time, and optimizing both the safety and fairness in whatever situation we are looking at. We have dealt with this type of issues are not really new to AI. We have been dealing as societies with this type of interpretations, this type of differences in how to define fairness, define safety, and enforcing these things in many different ways. And in what has been called the normative systems, or in AI, has been for a long time also looking at this type of issues, but not only in AI. The law is exactly meant to decide, to describe how should fairness be interpreted in one or another situation, how should safety be interpreted, what counts as safety, what counts as fairness, and so on. But not only law, but in many cases, the social practices which we learn and we develop as societies are exactly ways that are dealing with this issue. So as we're developing AI systems, we really can learn a lot by understanding how it has been done in other fields. So it is also very easy then to understand, okay, there is not one ethics. We cannot really agree on one single way to be ethical. So it's also easy to get very depressed, if you want, because then we just don't know, and the easier way out is just to ignore it all. So we do need to move to understand that between you doing nothing about the ethical issues or hoping that we can find the silver bullet that solves all these problems at the same time. And there is a balance between the two extremes, which we really need to take into account. And that is what many are talking about, the responsible development of AI systems, is really providing a transparent exposition of the choices and the factors and the issues that have been considered, and how have we interpret the different issues, the different values, the different principles that have been considered. So it's not going in one way in the universal ethics or a universal solution to all your problems, or completely quitting and saying, okay, I cannot decide, so then we just ignore the whole thing. But it's really assuming that values are implemented in the technology, and the best we can do is try to expose, to describe how those values have been implemented in the technologies that we are developing. It is also providing ways to adhere to access many of the general principles and, for instance, soft governance guidelines and recommendations that have been developed by many different organizations. And of course, there are always trade-offs. And again, the issue of who is deciding is central to all of this discussion. And there is indeed a lot of organizations that are trying to provide guidelines, to provide principles on how AI and what type of principles do we expect AI systems to adhere to. There are many of them, and there is so many that currently there are a lot of surveys happening about how this, who is developing guidelines for AI. I believe there are already over 200 of these different guidelines and principles, many of them by very large organizations. The latest and probably one of the widest acceptable, is the guidelines, the ethical guidelines by the UNESCO, which have been adopted just in December last year. But the European Union has been doing a lot of work in this area, even going so far at this moment as to developing formal regulations and laws to implement all these guidelines, but there are many more. If there are so many that the question at a certain moment starts being, okay, which one can I follow? And I don't really understand anymore. There are too many trees in this forest. How can I really make sense of what's happening? There are a few things to realize. One is that it is the platitude of this guidelines and this effort shows that it is something which is really concerning policymakers, governments, or international organizations. At the same time, we can see that in let's say the most abstract ways, they are not so different from each other. The European Union, OECD, and IEEE that I described there are indeed very aligned and the UNESCO one as well. They are very aligned in the recommendations that they make. What really becomes now the next step is, yes, okay, we understand that we should be develop systems to be accountable, transparent, aligned with human rights, with ensuring non-discrimination and diversity, transparency, and so on. The question now is, how are we going to ensure this? How are we going to implement, to develop, and to use systems that guarantee that these principles are being implemented? And it's also important to realize that most of these principles are not meant definitely by the organizations develop them as something that needs to be programmed directly into the AI algorithms, into the AI systems, but they are principles for us, for the people, for those involved in developing, managing, maintaining, using, collecting, creating the policy. So are really principles for the social technical ecosystem around the AI systems. And some of them might be directly implementable into code, but most of them are about the people involved in the definition, the design, the use, and the development of these systems. So indeed, it is important to move to just endorsing these principles, these guidelines, and so on is not enough. We really need to move into the compliance aspect. And there has been many efforts. I just referred to the current efforts at the European Union, so-called AI Act, which is really putting forward a proposal of formal regulation of law to be implemented in all the member states after approval by the European Parliament. It's an approach which takes a risk-based idea. So the more risicoful type of technology is used, the more risicoful application areas, the more the system needs to take into account all kinds of requirements and constraints. It is also takes an approach which is human-centered. So it's about those that are potentially harmed, potentially affected by the decisions of the systems. There is at this moment a very large discussion and dialogue going on at the European Parliament to really create this first regulation, European broad regulation for AI, which is at the same time which is one of the first in the world to really coming up with formal regulation. But the regulation is only one way to go about implementing or moving from principles to action. There is also a lot of work being done, for instance, by the IEEE and by the ISO in terms of developing standards. Standards are, by definition, not more a kind of soft governance. It's not really mandatory to follow the standard, but by following the standard, not only organizations will ensure due diligence and limit liability, but it also ensures that those using the standards will be facilitated in the integration between different products, different components, and so on. So there is quite a lot of organizational and the commercial benefit for adhering to different standards. At the same time, we see in industry and mostly in the large tech and consultancy companies in the world, a big effort into developing the offices of the posts of ethic officers or chief ethic or chief data officers, advisor ethical panels, and so on, which in many cases not only set and monitor the concrete ethical guidelines for the organization in which it's happening, but also there are cases in which these panels, these officers have the right to veto projects which they evaluate as not being adhering to the guidelines. There is also a lot of work done in terms of assessing the adherence of many different AI systems in terms of these many sets of guidelines that are developed. And especially here in Europe, there is a lot of work being done in the assessment of the trustworthy AI guidelines developed by the European Union. We need to understand that responsible AI ethics and so on is much more than just ticking the boxes, but at the other end, if we do have some type of assessment lists of guidelines to check, we also are able to understand better, and especially those which don't deal with these issues every day, have better ways to understand how much their products, what they are using and developing are or not aligned with what is expected, and also we can contribute to understand, to develop some type of maturity levels and understanding how can they improve the situation in which they are there. And of course, all of this needs to be grounded in some much more intensive efforts for awareness, for participation in terms of education and training, and also ensuring that all are able to participate in the discussion of when and how should AI be used. Another issue that often comes, especially when I give this type of talks for policymakers or for commercial private organizations, is this idea that the more effort and the more demands are put in the issues of regulation, of ethics, of responsibility, somehow these things are seen as a block in the innovation, that because we are talking about needing ethics, needing regulation, needing responsibility in AI, we are somehow limiting the capability of innovation. Me and many others are trying to show that actually it's the other way around. By asking and demanding and discussing the issues of ethics, of regulation, of responsibility, it's more of a stepping stone for innovation. If we really need systems to be verifiable and certifiable, fair, be verifiable, explanatory, be verifiable, minimizing energy consumption and so on, then we really are asking the whole AI field, the AI research, to move forward into some further than what the existing state of the art is. So we really, all these demands are a call for stepping further than the current state of the art. That also ensures not only by putting the regulation is not only a matter of ensuring public acceptance, but really also a drive for transformation, because organizations, researchers, companies can really show and really starting transforming the way they are using AI into ways that really are not only innovative and accurate and so on, but at the same time respecting all the human values and human rights and society principles that we do need these systems to adhere to. And you can also see it as a way to provide business differentiation between those who are investing into developing the ethical versions and those that are not. I just need to check what time is it. No, I think I'm going to very soon close, and this will be my last slide. So then we have some time for questions. So when we talk about taking responsibility, it's about ensuring not only that the systems, AI systems, the AI algorithms are behaving by design, the behavior and the results of the systems are aligned with those ethical principles that are important for those that are around it, but also mostly to look at what are the processes through which we are developing these systems. How can we guarantee that the whole process of development, from the inception, from the first idea to the use and maintenance and effect as the system starts being implemented in real life, that the whole process is also verifiable and guaranteed, taken a responsibility approach to development and innovation. But also we need to look at how us, all the different stakeholders, are able to take our own responsibility for the systems that are being developed. And I think I will stop here. I had quite some more slides, but I think that the main idea that I would like to share with you is it has been sufficiently described now, and I see that we in this way we'll have some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Virginia, for your wonderful talk and the really important topic. I just want to remind everyone that you can put your questions in Q&A, or if you put in chat, we'll catch it as well. So I see a question from Sadia Han in chat. How can we balance the value of local and contextual solutions for producing more trustworthy outcomes with the need for some sort of generalizability and common definitions about the set of ethical concepts you have listed?
Yeah.
So let's go from here.
Very good question. Yes, very good question. Thank you for your question, Sadia. I think that these more general common definitions are what we are seeing developed by these large international organizations like UNESCO, UNICEF, the OECD, the European Union for the case here. And I'm sorry, I don't really know sufficiently what's happening in the States, but all these international organizations are defining let's say, the broad scope, the large abstract principles that we want to adhere to, that we require these systems to adhere to: responsibility, fairness, transparency, explainability, and so on. At the same time, it is important to provide the means, like I said, to not only to interpret these issues in the face of the situation in which the systems are being implemented, also interpret it given the possibilities, the technical possibilities of the technology being used, and some technology is more suitable for some of these principles than others. So we do need to provide the means to interpret fairness in different ways. But what is really important, and that's where I think that the bridge between the contextual solution and the general principles is the need for being explicit and documentable in terms of how and why this type of interpretations have been reached. So who was involved in deciding that equity is a better interpretation of the fairness principle than equality, and why was that, and what kind of motives and arguments and evidence has been given in a discussion and who has been involved in that discussion that leads to deciding that in a certain context, like I say, equity is a better way to interpret fairness than equality. So it's not about the decision, one or the other, but about being explicit and being verifiable and providing the evidence for why was that decision taken. And also be able to reflect and to go back and to revisit this type of decisions as the system evolves, as the situation might become different later on. So this issue of explicit and open and transparent support for decision making is one of the ways that has been advocated by many of the organizations that are looking at this more broad abstract ethical guidelines.
Okay, so let me ask you, well, let's respond to Monica first. What is some of the work that you have done in this space?
Okay, good. That was the rest of the slides that I didn't show you. So I have been working both with the policymakers. I worked with the UNESCO in the definition of the guidelines that appeared last year in December. I worked with the European Union. I was one of the 50 experts that the European Union appoints to define and to write down the principles for trustworthy AI. I'm also working with the UNICEF defining the guidance for AI and children. And I've been working with many other of these large international organizations. IEEE, I also have been part of the Committee for Ethically Aligned Design for many years now. So I'm working both at working both with the policymakers, the designers of these large abstract systems. And at the same time, in my research group, we are looking at methods and tools to provide not only the assessment and monitoring of these principles in many different concrete applications of AI, but we are also looking at ways to verify and provide a form of verification that systems that we build or that are built by others, even black box, that can be verifiable in their adherence to some of these principles. So we are looking, for instance, at ways to apply input-output logics to provide a way to measure the quality of decisions made by those so-called black boxes. I see now there are more questions in the Q&A. Let me just look at that. To what extent can or should people working in AI ethics work with companies developing novel AI technology, given that those companies have financial incentives? Is there room for collaboration, or will inherently be a conflict? It's a very good question, and it's a question that many of us has been struggling with. I am a firm believer that we do need to work together. We, of course, companies have other incentives than researchers and than policymakers, than governments, and so on. But what is at stake is too important for us to focus more on what is the difference between us than what united us. It was very nice to see the way that 173 countries in the world united together in very complex and very long discussions at UNESCO meetings in order to come up with guidelines which were broad enough and satisfying enough for all this variety of cultures, this variety of backgrounds, and create something which all these countries were satisfied and hopeful that they can really contribute to the way that AI is going to impact the lives of citizens across the globe. it's if that was possible to be done with the countries as different as the European countries, Russia, China, Iran, Afghanistan, African countries, and so on. Unfortunately, United States are at this moment not part of the UNESCO, but they were observers and working together with other ones in the working groups that we had. So if we all together we are able to develop guidelines which satisfied, like I say, all these different countries, I'm sure that we will also be able to bridge between the difference of private companies, the big tech, and the interests and the needs of the citizens. So I think that we really need to be able to work together. So the question of Jenny Radesky on how considerations for responsible AI differ for children. I don't think that they really differ for children, but it's important as we develop AI systems and as we develop not only the systems, but also the guidelines, that we understand that children are a very important part of the population, and a component of the population which not always understands and uses the systems in the same way. So the guidelines for the responsible development and use of AI need to explicitly consider how to protect children, how to provide the best possible service for children, but that also how can we engage and get children to participate and to understand how the AI is impacting their lives. So it's more to make explicit to the policymakers and the ones developing AI systems that it's important to look at how children are part of the equation than to make a different guideline for children. And now I see that Efren Cruz has a question. I really like the consolidation of innovation and ethical design. What fundamental changes do you think we must do in AI research to drive this goal? I think, so if we go back to AI research and now talking to the computer scientists, the data analysts between us, and I believe that many of you will be like me, fitting in this part of the field, it is important to realize that data-driven approach only, expecting that data and algorithms such as the deep learning and other stochastic ways to analyze data and to make predictions based in data have their benefits, and we all are experiencing the benefits and the potential of how can we predict and identify patterns and make sense of data using this type of technology. But at the same time, we have limits to what can be done with data-driven models alone. So I think that one of the things that it is increasingly important and increasingly recognized in research in AI is that we need to find ways to combine and to integrate the potential of data-driven algorithms in the ways that it really enables to make sense of the data around us, with the potential of more model-driven or rule-based systems, which provide the capability of explanation, the capability of justification and transparency that are for some part much more difficult in the data-driven approaches. So I think that what we need to see is to really look at a combination and develop ways in which we can combine the benefits of data-driven and rule-based systems in a more efficient and more fundamental, fundamentally fundamental research in combining this type of different approaches in AI.
We're almost time. I wonder if I can ask the last question, which is
Sure.
really what you talked about, balancing using ethics regulation as a way to promote innovation, not to stifle innovation. But I think this balance is something that a lot of people still need to be convinced about, right? So, when you recently I was having an argument with some of my friends, right? So, and some would say, the priority is really to gather as much data as possible because that really gives an organization, a corporation, even a country, some some more power to use data science and AI for strategies. But on the other hand, if you rush to collect data and to use data, then where is your privacy concern? And then on the other hand, with the privacy concerns, people are developing more and more privacy preserving platforms and privacy preserving computing. And also more, the newer learning models use less and less data. And these are innovations partly driven by privacy concerns.
Yeah.
So how do you balance the two, and how do you convince people that they should balance the two?
That's a good question. I don't think that I can convince people myself or alone, but there is indeed, at the end of the day, no one is really going for, let's say, no one wants to have AI that is illegal, that is unethical, that is irresponsible. That is a no-go for no one and if you know that doing that knowingly, it's not really the ambition of no organization, no stakeholder in the whole issue. The point is that what we are seeing, and like you explained, you very well explained, we are seeing a kind of solving afterwards what the problems that we caused before. And what I think that it's the way to consider is before we rush into yet more data or yet more larger computational power and this idea that more data gives you more power and more a better stake in the field, needs to be balanced by the realization that all this data not necessarily gives you that power, and that before we start collecting the data, we really need to think about why are we collecting this data, who is going to benefit from it, what kind of potential problems will come from the fact that you collect data, because the more data you collect, the more responsibility you have for that data. It's not only about the privacy, it's also issues of sustainability, because you have to keep that data somewhere. It's also issues of security and safety. You have to make sure that that data is safe, that there are no breaches in and no possibility for people to somehow tamper that data. So you are increasing a lot of the responsibility and the efforts that you need to do by the idea that more data is better, before instead of thinking more carefully about what is the real meaning and the real need for that data.
Yeah, so thank you so much for this wonderful talk.
Thank you very much.
I know this is late night for you. So
it's quite late, yes.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. And thank you everyone
problem.
for being in the audience, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.